Hi class, welcome. Today we're going to continue our discussion on physics, chapter 3, 10th edition, Kremkau transducers. Please go ahead and open up to page 51. Okay, so up until now, we've been talking about sound waves and we've been drawing them like this, which has been, sinusoidal and, cycles, peaks and troughs, positive and negative halves of a pressure cycle. I also mentioned that from this, we have to kind of transition our thoughts and start thinking about sound waves as having this trumpet shape. And so there are parts to a sound wave. And so you guys can go ahead and draw this out. And we've also, so here as the sound wave is getting tighter, that's called converging. And then it converges to its most minimal point, which is called the focal point. And this is where the sound wave is at its most smallest area. And we should know that when the area decreases, there's an increase in API, in amplitude, power, and intensity. And then the sound wave starts to flare out more and it starts to diverge. The area that is around the focal point, so I would start with this first, and then the area that's around the focal point, so this focal zone, you'll notice that the area here is pretty small. The area, it's pretty small. However, it's still not as small as it is at the focal point. So like the focal zone has like a funny way of being described in Kremkau. And basically what he's saying is like this part of the sound wave is small. It's not as small as the focal point or the focus, but it's still pretty small. The area from the face of the transducer to the focus is called the focal length. Sometimes they call it, the focal length is not the most common way of describing this. I also want to draw attention to this. When people hear focal, they automatically think about the focal point. And so on the test, when it says the focal length, a lot of people are like, oh, they're talking about the focus or like the focal point or the focal zone. This is just because the word focus, or focal is there. It is not the same location. So draw attention to that so you don't forget. And we're going to talk about some AKAs for that because there's definitely other ways of saying it. And then there is the far zone. And so now I'm going to give you guys some AKAs. Okay, the focal point, it's also called the focus. So go ahead and write that down. The focal length area is also called the near zone, the near zone length, the near field, or the Fresnel zone. So these are all AKAs. I know there's a lot of them, but actually, if you really think about it, there's just 3. The most common way of saying it is like near. So they'll say like near zone length. That's like the most common. Fresnel zone is like the second most common. And again, it could be like Fresnel field. It's typically Fresnel zone. The one that is going to throw you off, because it throws everybody off at some point, is the focal length. And why is it called the focal length? Just so you guys know, the best part of your image, the most accurate part of your image is going to be wherever the focus is. So this area right here is going to produce the most accurate part of your image. The second most accurate part is going to be anything in the near zone or the focal length. And because this is like the second most accurate part, that's where it comes from, like focal length. Like, why are they calling it focal length? Because that's also like an area that's like the second best. The worst part of the image, or like the most inaccurate, is going to be anything in the far zone. the wider the transducer gets, the wider the beam gets, the more negative effect it has on your image. So like the smaller the area, the better the image, because there's also a higher amplitude, power, and intensity. The wider the beam, the more negative effect it has on your image, because there's a decrease in amplitude, power, and intensity. The far zone, so this guy out here, the far zone is also called the far field or Fraunhofer. Fraunhofer. And so you guys want to put those AKAs down. Another thing you want to draw attention to is that the size of the beam or the pulse or the ultrasound or whatever we're going to call it, the size of the beam is equal to the transducer diameter as it leaves the transducer. So you'll notice that the transducer and the beam as it leaves the transducer are equal in diameter, right? You don't have, if you're like, I don't get it. If this is my transducer, like my beam is not going to be like this, right? My beam is going to come out from one end of the transducer to the other end of the transducer. And then again, it reaches its most minimal point, the focus or the focal point, and then it starts to diverge out. And at this point, it reaches the exact same diameter as it started with. So these two diameters are the same. So where am I when I talk about this guy right here? I am at the end of the far zone, right? However, on the test, they word it really funny and it trips people up. What they say is they say at the end of two near zone lengths. So if you think about it, this is the near zone length, right? Let me switch colors so you guys can see it. Okay, so this is the near zone length, right? From here to here. Well, if I double that, so this is one near zone length. If I do two near zone lengths and I go to this side here, my beam is going to be the same diameter as it was when it first started, or when it, at the beginning of the focal length, or when it first left the transducer. So you can even see here, the diameter at two near zone length equals the transducer diameter. And so this trips people up because they're like, well, why, if we're talking about that part of the beam, why are we even calling it the near zone length? I don't know. It's silly, right? Like they should call it, in the far zone, but this is how they measure it. They say at the end of two near zone lengths. And obviously, at some point we have to stop drawing the beam. And so we typically stop drawing it at the end of two near zone lengths or at the far zone. But if we could still see it past this, the beam would just like diverge even more, and then obviously have an even worse effect on your image because it is attenuating, it's losing its amplitude, power, and intensity. Okay, with that being said, so we went from our sinusoidal sound waves, right? That's how we started at the beginning of chapter 2. That's what we were thinking about. To now our trumpet-shaped sound waves, okay? Now we're going to take it one step further. Sound waves are actually three-dimensional, so they actually have 3 dimensions to them. So this is a good picture to look at. So if we're talking about the length of the sound wave, so a measurement from here down to the end of the sound wave, that is called the length of the sound wave. Or the length of the beam, right? And this will determine something called axial resolution. We don't know what axial resolution is just yet. However, the resolutions are heavily tested on the SPI, and we got to know them in and out before we sit for our exam. If we measure the width of the beam, so here's the width, notice I'm doing it on the same part of the beam where this, so guys, the red part is the length of the beam, right? Or like the length of the scan plane. Scan plane is like the direction that you are imaging. It's called scan plane, okay? So the red is the length of the scan plane. This blue color notice I'm still measuring it on the scan plane, but I'm measuring it perpendicular to that, right? But so for this, what I want you guys to write down for the blue is the width in the scan plane, right? So I'm measuring the width, however, I'm still measuring it on the same part of the beam as the scan plane was located. And then there's this one, and this is also the beam width. However, it is not the same as in the scan plane, right? Because if you look at the two lines that cross, it's my blue line and my red line that cross, because you're measuring the same surface of the beam. You're only measuring it in two different ways. So like, for example, if you grab a book, right? Grab a book, and I tell you, measure the cover of the book, right? Measure the front cover, but you are going to be measuring, right? So here's your book, right? And it's like opened like this, and then here's your cover. You could measure the book from here to here, or you can measure it from here to here, but you're measuring like the same surface of the book, right? Like you're measuring that same surface. So that's the idea behind the blue and the red here. The red is the length of the book, let's say, and the blue is the width of the book. But we are talking, you're measuring it on the same surface, and we call that surface the scan plane, okay? And the blue is going to determine something called lateral resolution. And again, we don't really know a whole lot about lateral resolution. However, if you were paying attention to me in my lectures, I have mentioned it before. I have mentioned it before one other time. And then the green is also measuring the width. However, it's called the width perpendicular to the scan plane, not the width in the scan plane. And that is important to know. The blue is the width in the scan plane. The green is the width perpendicular to the scan plane. I tell my students, just if it says the word perpendicular, it's talking about the green one, okay? And what is being measured here, so again, it's a measurement of the width perpendicular to the scan plane, or the beam thickness is another way of saying it, like an AKA, the beam thickness, or they also refer to it as the third dimension. So as you can see, there's three different dimensions to the beam, right? It's a three-dimensional structure. The green represents a measurement of the third dimension. So ideally, axial would be like the first dimension, lateral would be the second, and elevational would be the third, because that green beam that I just drew out, so like this one right here, that's a measurement of the beam thickness, the beam width perpendicular to the scan plane, and it has to do with elevational resolution, which we don't know about yet. But so I want you guys to go from that, the sinusoidal sound waves that we, first learned about, and we have to learn about them because that's how we learn about, period, frequency, wavelength, pulsed ultrasound, PRP, PRF, SPL, PD, right? We had to do that. And then we went to our trumpet shaped sound waves, right? And now like the real deal, and I promise I won't ever change it again. This is like the last one that you guys have to use your imagination for, is this. It's a third dimensional sound wave. So there's three different dimensions. What you want to know, and we're going to talk a lot about these, but what you want to know at this point is that none of the measurements are equal. So like every single one of those three measurements will have a different measurement, okay? And so on page 51, he's going to kind of introduce that idea to us, but we don't know a whole lot about it just yet. So on page 51, under beams and focusing, halfway through that paragraph, he says, generally, the width in the scan plane. So I want you to think about what the width in the scan plane is. The width in the scan plane is this one right here. The width in the scan plane is not the same as the width perpendicular to the scan plane. So he's saying this green arrow is not the same measurement as this red arrow. The width in the scan plane, so again, he's talking about the green, determines lateral resolution. whereas the width perpendicular to the scan plane determines the extent of section thickness artifact. He shouldn't have said section thickness artifact. It's way too soon. So leave it there, because at one point in our lectures, that will make sense. It just like doesn't make sense today because he said it so early. Like we just don't know enough about it yet. So where it says, whereas the width perpendicular to the scan plane determines, I want you to add elevational resolution, elevational resolution. Okay. And we're going to jump ship a little bit. So we just learned this, okay? Store this in your brain, push it to the back. We got to expand on this a lot more. We're just not there yet. But now we're going to jump ship to something like some people ask, why does the shape of the sound wave have that shape? Like, why does it have to be trumpet shape? You know, like what's going on? Why can't it just look different? You know, like why does it have to be trumpet shape? So there's this guy named Hudgens, and Hudgens decided to come up with this theory. And he was like, oh, I can explain it. I can explain why the sound wave has this particular shape. So I'm going to explain this theory to you, and it's like a little funny, but a lot of people forget about Hudgens' principle, or like, or about this theory. And what I remember is like an easy way for my brain to recall it is I'm like, what is the purpose of Hudgens? Like, what was his deal? Like, what did he want to accomplish? And what he wanted to accomplish is he wanted to give the world, you know, thank God, no, but he wanted to give the world an explanation as to why the sound wave is this shape. Okay. So he came up with this theory, and he said really small pieces of PZTs, right? So you guys know what PZTs are. They're also called crystals, active elements, lead, zirconate, titanate. So he said small pieces of PZTs are now called Hudgens sources. So clearly this guy really loved his name, because he has used his name as much as possible. So he said, I'm not going to call him a PZT anymore, right? He said, I'm going to call these Hudgens sources, like fine, whatever, right? And then he says, each source, so each small piece of PZT will produce a V-shaped wave. Those V-shaped waves are called spherical waves, diffraction patterns, or guess what? He said it again, his own name, Hudgens wavelets. Okay, so I know that this is probably like, what? Like, why are we talking about this? I don't know, right? But like, don't we often feel that way in physics, right? Here's the thing. Don't connect Hudgens to anything else but the shape of the wave. Remember that this dude loves his own name, and he's going to put it into the theory as much as possible. Okay, so, and I'm going to draw some pictures to show you. So he said really small pieces of PZT, right? So like here's a small piece of PZT. It's going to create a sound wave, but the sound wave is going to look like this. Okay, so that small piece of PZT is what he calls a Hudgens source. This V-shaped sound wave is what he calls spherical waves, diffraction patterns, or Hudgens wavelets, okay? And then he says, so the reason this principle is kind of funny, right? Because like we don't really use really, really small pieces of PZT in the transducer. So he like took it a step further. He's like, okay, I have an explanation for using large pieces of PZT. He says a large active element, so like a large PZT, can be thought of as millions of tiny ones, or like millions of tiny Hudgens sources. Each source creates a V-shaped wave. Wavelets will interfere constructively or in phase and destructively out of phase. The interference of these wavelets create an hourglass shape of the beam. So at the bottom, I reminded you again of like what this guy's purpose was. And he said, Hudgens' principle explains the shape of an imaging transducer's emitted beam. So the shape of the beam, right? You can take out the extra words. That's okay. The shape of the beam, based upon the in-phase and out-of-phase wavelets interfering with one another. So let me draw a picture for you guys that will kind of explain Hudgens a little bit more. Okay, so this guy said a big piece of PZT, so here's my big piece of PZT, can be thought of as a bunch of small pieces of PZT. So let's just pretend that this large piece of PZT is actually just like a bunch of smaller pieces of PZTs, right? So I'm just gonna put a bunch in there. What are those called? Those are called Hudgens sources, okay? Each one of those PZTs is going to release a sound wave, and the sound wave has that spherical diffraction pattern. It's like a semicircle. So each one of these PZTs is going to release a sound wave that looks like this. Okay, so we're going to be here a while. Okay, so I'm just going to do this. We're going to pretend, right? So these are all diffraction patterns. I just like didn't want to keep doing that. So you can do them. You can make your notes like really nice. I just like didn't want to do that. So, okay, so now you have all these wavelets, all these Hudgens wavelets, all these diffraction patterns, all these spherical waves. So what do you think all those waves, all those little mini beams are going to do? They're going to bump into each other. They're going to interfere. And when they interfere with each other, they're going to interfere constructively, and destructively. So I want you to think back at what another way of saying constructive is in phase. Another way of saying destructive is out of phase. What do we know about constructive interference? We know that constructive interference results in a higher amplitude. Remember, I told you guys that echoes or pulses or whatever will interfere with each other. They become like a super strong power couple. And then destructive interference is where the result is a weaker amplitude, power, and intensity of a beam, or so it's like partial or total destruction, right? And so these little wavelets will also interfere constructively and destructively. And that's like as much as the books will really tell us, right? But like this still doesn't explain a whole lot about the principle, because like if you look at my picture, it still doesn't have that trumpet shape. So I've kind of helped students remember it a different way. So if I took an eraser and I erased all of these here in the yellow, and I took an eraser and I erased all of these in the yellow. Now look at the shape of my sound wave. Now the shape of my sound wave, right, if you look at it, it has that trumpet shape, which is exactly what Hudgens does, like what he wants to talk about. So I've told students an easy way to remember this is remember that the wavelets on the outside here on the edges are going to destructively interfere. The wavelets here in the middle are going to constructively interfere. So the ones that are destructively interfering, the ones that are in the yellow, those are going to cancel each other out, right? So when the interference happens, they cancel each other out. Well, if they cancel each other out, they're not going to be there anymore, right? And so, and they're not there because they have destructively interfered with each other. And so because the ones in the yellow, the wavelets that were in the yellow, they kind of interfere in a manner that cancels them out, you're left with the ones in the center that have like constructively interfered and therefore have resulted in this trumpet shaped beam, which is like the shape of our sound wave. So again, books don't really tell you about, like, oh, the ones in the wavelets in the center constructively interfere and the ones on the outside destructively interfere. They don't do that. Like they don't take it into such depth. They basically just want you to know that Hudgens has this idea that a large piece of PZT can be thought of as a bunch of small sources. They will each release Huggens wavelets, and those wavelets will constructively and destructively interfere and therefore cause the trumpet shape of the beam. And that's it. Like that's all they say. But I think it like just makes more sense when you think about it like this. And then you also remember its purpose. You remember like what was Huggens' deal? Like what did he want to talk about? And so this is like another picture that I got from a book, but this is a cool picture, but what you're not seeing is like the mini sources. So like, you know, I would add like those little pieces and then like what parts are constructively and destructively interfering. I just remember that it's destructive on the outside, constructive in the middle, and that's what causes this shape of the beam. So this is actually on page 51 under the advanced concept box. And again, you'll see that it's just like so limited. He says the formation of the beam is explained by the Huggens principle. And then a few lines down, the Huggens principle states that all points of a wave front or at a source, all points on a wave front or at a source can be considered as point sources for the production of spherical wavelets. So like that doesn't really tell me anything. But my explanation is a little bit more in depth, and there's not a whole lot to know about it. And you know what, like let's just take it because there's a lot of other stuff we got to learn. But you know, they might ask you questions about like what his principle's all about. It's all about the shape of the beam. And the shape of the beam is explained by constructive and destructive interference. And then sometimes they ask about those sources, like what he wanted to call them. And remember, he doesn't talk about one large PZT. He says one large PZT in his theory is actually described as a bunch of smaller PZTs that are put together. So actually in my book, I have like one of those larger Post-its, and I drew that picture that I drew with you guys, and I just like taped it right over the advanced concept box on page 51. So when I'm studying, I know that this is where the book talks about the Huggens principle, but actually like my picture is what I need to be able to explain the theory to someone else. So you should put that into your book as well if you have a set of Post-its. Okay, page 52, he says that he's going to talk to you about focusing. So remember the focal point. But again, this section of the book, for whatever reason, it's just like really choppy and he's just kind of a little bit all over the place. So you're going to highlight under focusing, diagnostic transducers are focused. So remember, what is the purpose of a diagnostic tech or like a diagnostic ultrasound tech? Is to produce diagnostic pictures to a doctor. So like if we're going to produce pictures for a doctor to interpret, to diagnose the patient, obviously the camera that we're using, which is our transducer, has to be focused, right? It's like if you were like a photographer and you were like, look, this is my job, I'm a photographer, but I take pictures for a living, but I'm going to go buy a camera that doesn't focus. Like none of us would do that, right? In fact, when you pull out your phone to take a picture and your screen isn't focused, what do? We tap on it to focus our picture. I mean, nobody wants a bunch of unfocused pictures. So it's the same. Diagnostic transducers, because we're taking pictures, they have to be focused, right? Nobody's going to buy a blurry, unfocused picture. And then on the third line, it says sound may be focused by using a curved rather than a flat transducer element, by using a lens, or by phasing. And so I'm going to talk to you guys about all of that in a little bit. Focusing narrows the beam. So think about what the focus is. You guys know what the focus is. This is the area of the focus. So it narrows the beam, right? That's where the beam comes to a narrow point, or the smallest area. Beam width is decreased in the focal region, which is called the focal zone, and in the area between it and the transducer, which is called the near zone, but it is widened in the region beyond, termed the far zone. And I'm going to talk to you guys about that in a moment. And then you're going to take out your highlighter that you highlight definitions with. And we're talking about the focal length. So remember, this is that funny one that like if you're not careful on the test, this is the one that's going to get us, the focal length. So he says the focal length is the distance from the transducer to the center of the focal region. The focal zone, so look at here, guys, this is what I'm talking about. The focal zone, and they're also calling it focal region, is, and this is the definition that everybody hates. The focal zone is the length, is the distance between equal beam widths that are some multiple of the minimum value of the focus. Okay, so the definition for focus is minimum value. So there's actually 3 definitions there. The first one that we just highlighted, which was focal length. Then there's a focus, which is called the minimum value. And then there's the focal zone. And the focal zone definition is the distance between equal beam widths that are some multiple of the minimum. And I know you guys highlighted that, but I also want you to underline some multiple of the minimum, some multiple of the minimum, because the definition for focal zone is so crazy. It gets everybody. And so I just tell people, look, basically in English, he's saying, this is where the beam is small, but it's not as small as it is in the focus. Like that's what that would translate to. Like, what is the focal zone? The focal zone is where the beam is small, right? It's the area around the focus. The beam is small, but it's not as small as it is at the exact point of the focus. So it's like kind of small, but not as small. That's what it would translate to if we were like just talking to each other. So what helps me is to remember that it's some multiple of the minimum. So it's like some number that's close to the minimum value. Okay. So, for example, if I measured, like, this is totally not real. Okay. But for example, if I measured from here to here, you know, what is that area? And I said, like, okay, so this is like 1 centimeter, let's say, like measuring that whole focal focus. And then let's say I measured from here to here. This would be like 6 centimeter. If I measured here, right, this would be 6 centimeter. Remember, because those match. If I measure anywhere here, right, this would be close to 1, but it can't be 1 because it's not the focal point. The focal point has to be the smallest. So maybe in this area, I have a range of like 2 to 3, because notice it's like a little bit bigger here, and then it's like tightening up. So there'll be like a little bit of a range in measurement. And so this focal zone will probably be like 2 to 3. Which again, 2 to 3 is close to the minimum value of 1 at the focus, but it's not exactly 1. So when you think about focal zone, just think about like, okay, the definition is going to be like kind of too much of a definition. It's like the distance between equal beam widths. Like, we don't need all of that. It's really just a multiple of the minimum. Is it saying the minimum? No, it's saying a multiple of the minimum. Basically saying, look, it's not the minimum value, but it's close to it. Okay, so, and then if you go back to your other highlighter, it says, while the element or lens is increasingly curved, the focus moves, page 54, closer to the transducer and becomes tighter. Okay, on the next couple lines, it says the size of the source of the element, so the PZT or the crystal or the element, whatever, is termed aperture. So he's not gonna say PZT. When he's talking about the size of the PZT, he's gonna use the word aperture. So don't let that word scare you. Aperture is the size of the PZT. Like, is it a big PZT or is it a small PZT? It's just aperture. Aperture is the size of the PZT. That's the definition. So he is all like, in this little couple pieces that we've highlighted, he's literally told us two different types of focusing, and he combined like 3 ideas into one. So we're going to clarify with our notes, right? Okay. So let's go back to what we said. We said the best part of your image, where is it? The best part of your image, it is at the focus. We're going to put a star there. Where's the highest API, amplitude, power, and intensity? At the focus. The second best part of your image, right? The second runner up, number 2, where is that? Anywhere in the near zone, right? So like from here to here, this is the second best part of your image. Worst part, sad face, is anything in the far zone or the Fraunhofer zone. So sometimes our sound waves look like this. And sometimes our sound waves look like this. They're both trumpet shaped, right? What is a huge difference is this. How long is the near zone? How long is the near zone? Does it really matter how long the near zone is? Well, yeah, like it's the second best part of your image, right? It has like the second best resolution or detail. Look, your focus is the best, but can like all of your image be at the focus? No. If you're like, I don't get it. So when you're scanning, here's your image, you're scanning, right? Wherever this focus is put, this is number 1, best part of your image. Okay, great. But look how much other part of your image there is. Like a small piece of it is at the focus, right? Okay. Anything from this point up is in the near zone length. So this is the second best part of your image. Anything from this point down is in the far field, and this is like the worst part, or like the third part, best. So 1, 2, and 3 is just talking about like number 1 being the best, number 2, number 3 being the worst. Okay. So like a lot of your image is in the near zone, right? Like there's only a small part of the image that's actually at the focus. It's such a small part of your image, like only this, right? But like, what about all the other stuff? So like we care how much near zone length we have, right? Because that's also like an important part of your image. So we're going to talk about what determines near zone length. How come some beams, so let me draw this picture because I hope that this like really brings it home for you. So here's a picture and here is another picture. Let's say that the focus is here. And remember, anything above it is in the near zone length. This would be a beam that looks like this. It has a long near zone length, right? If my focus is up here, anything above it is in the near zone length. So this would be a beam that looks like this. See how the beams look different? If you're like, well, I can't tell, identify where the focus is. This is my focus. This is the focus of the beam. This is my focus. This is the focus of the beam. Everything above it is in the near zone length. So it must have a long near zone length. Everything above the focus is in the near zone length. So this one has a short near zone length, right? Anything below the focus is in the Fraunhofer zone. The Fraunhofer zone. And then like this part doesn't really matter, the Fraunhofer. We're just like, my point is I'm trying to tell you about the near zone length. Okay, like that's what I'm getting at. The near zone length is important and we need to figure out what determines it. So near zone length, and people hate this part of physics. The near zone length is determined by 2 things. But wait, hold on. This sounds really familiar because we've made a list together about determining factors, right? So on our list, we should have what determines attenuation. We should also have what determines frequency for a pulsed wave transducer. So before you move on, this would be a really good time to pause the video, right? The beauty of a recorded, and review that so you can see, you can refresh your memory, right? Because I'm not going anywhere. And then come back to me and we will talk about what determines near zone length. So what determines near zone length? You're going to put this on your list as your third thing, right? As your third, what determines by, and this is what determines near zone length. And you're going to put element size, remember, which we're going to call aperture, and those are directly related, and frequency are directly related as well. But notice I put here bad physics, bad physics. And guys, it's literally termed bad physics. Like it's coined that. I once had a student who had such a problem with me saying that. She was like, I don't like that you're saying bad physics. I feel like it's so subjective. It's not subjective. Also, I'm not the one that invented this. Like, thank you for the credit, but I didn't invent physics. And so it literally will help you remember it if you tell yourself, oh, near zone length is determined by aperture and near zone length is determined by frequency, which is the bad physics. Acknowledging that this is bad physics will help you remember it. So I think you should write it down. Let me explain to you how aperture affects near zone length. So remember, aperture is the element size. So I'm going to take two PZTs. So I'm going to have my small PZT, my small aperture, and my big aperture. So you can write that down. This is small and this is large or big, whatever. My small aperture in my small PZT in my transducer will create a beam that has a short near zone length. So small, short near zone length. So the beam will look like this. My big, right? So again, remember, I'm talking about the near zone length, right? My big aperture will create a long or a big near zone length. So it'll look like this, right? So like my near zone length is a lot longer. I tell students when you're drawing this picture, shade this in. Shade in your near zone length with a highlighter. Like make it stick in your brain, right? Like I sometimes will really be dramatic with my pictures and I do it for a reason. Like I want that bad boy to stick in my brain. And so notice here, right? If my size increases, my aperture, my PZT size, my aperture increases, I put size. Maybe I should have put A, right? So if my aperture increases, like it gets bigger, like a big aperture, right? My near zone length also increases, right? Like the increase just means bigger. If you don't like arrows, if arrows confuse you, then literally write, if aperture increases, my near zone length increases. So two arrows up, what does that mean? That they are directly related. And that's what we said here, right? We said that element size or aperture, they are directly related. So this one's the one that makes sense, right? Small near zone, big near zone. Like this one's not the one that plays tricks on your brain. It's the frequency one. So let's talk about frequency. So now I'm going to draw two transducers. I'm going to draw, and I'm going to, draw them the same because I'm not talking about aperture anymore. I'm talking about frequency. So I'm going to add two frequencies. I'm going to add my 2 and my 20 megahertz. Okay, small and large. So this is my low frequency. And obviously this is my high frequency. Okay. I want you to think about, why am I using a low frequency transducer such as a 2? Is my goal to image deep or is my goal to image superficial? Deep, right? The answer is deep. I'm going to grab my 2 megahertz transducer so I can image deep into the body. So what would you think would make sense? If I'm trying to image deep, doesn't it make sense that I would have a long near zone length? Yes, that is what would make sense. However, this is why it is coined bad physics. The sound wave that's coming out of a low frequency transducer actually looks like this. The sound that's coming out of a high frequency transducer, even though I'm imaging superficial, actually looks like this. So let's like really dramatize it. We're gonna shade it in. Right? So this is why it's called bad physics, because it just doesn't make any sense, right? Why are they designed like this? Like why is a low frequency transducer that's designed to penetrate and give me a longer, field of view, like more imaging into the body. It's going to go deeper into the body. Why does it have such a small, sad little near zone length? And then my high frequency, where I'm trying to only image superficial structures, it has a long near zone length, like I don't know, but this is going to be on your SPI. And this is why we call it bad physics, because it literally doesn't make sense. And ultrasound techs that have taken their SPI have just kind of learned to accept it, that it is just bad physics. And I think the more we like talk about it, the easier it is to just like remember it. But it does kind of get people on the test. Like every once in a while, it'll kind of stump you. There's, this is like pictures that I've found that kind of explain this. I don't really like this as much. I don't think it's as helpful as like what I've done, but you're welcome to look at it. As a review, what two things determine attenuation? And what are their relationships? Path length and frequency, direct. What two things determine frequency for a pulse wave transducer, right? Not a continuous pulse wave transducer. Element thickness and prop speed. Let me tell you something. Element thickness is not aperture. Aperture is element size, right? So like sometimes students are like, well, isn't thickness and size the same thing? No, it's like different dimensions, right? So like if I have a PZT that looks like this, or a PZT that looks like this, right? I'm talking about the size here. If I picked them up and like held them in my hand and like flipped them to the side and looked at the thickness, like the thickness is like two different things, right? So like, okay, imagine if they were books. You have a small book and a big book, but when you look at the side of the book, like they each have the exact same thickness because they have the exact same number of pages. Just because one is big and one is small, but they're both like 200 pages and like they have the exact same thickness, right? So like the size of the book is called aperture. The thickness is just thickness. So sometimes students kind of like don't like that. So our beams are the best when they are focused or at the most minimal point. So you can see here at the bottom picture says like the actual beam for ultrasound, remember for diagnostic, is focused. And then they show you what an ideal beam would look like. Like an ideal beam would be small in area all the way through from start to finish, but it's like just not what we're dealing with. So yeah, so unfortunately, ours do diverge at some point, which like create a like poor quality image at that part. All right, so I did have to show myself here to explain this next part. Obviously, it's late and I am pretty tired, but I wanted to talk to you about what is on page 52 about focusing at the top, okay? So we know what some of those definitions mean, but what he said at the very beginning, so he says that diagnostic transducers are focused, right? And then he says that sound may be focused by using a curved lens or whatever. So we're not talking about that just yet. But right here where it says focusing narrows the beam. So like this is what I'm talking about. Focusing narrows the beam. The beam width is decreased in the focal region, also called the focal zone, and in the area between it and the transducer, and is widened in the far zone. So what I have told students in the past is like they're going to ask you a lot of questions about focusing because they want you to know that like, you know, like focusing is important for us. And obviously we're here to take pictures, and so like we're going to have focus transducers, so we have to know how focusing is accomplished, how like, so we know how Bob, who works in the factory, we know how Bob is putting together the transducers when he's figuring out frequency, right? Remember, like what determines frequency? The prop speed of the element and the thickness of the element. So that's how Bob is putting the transducer together to determine frequency. But Bob also has to give us focused transducers, because like, why would we be buying transducers that are not focused, right? So we're going to learn about how Bob focuses the transducer. But the word focusing in general, they're going to ask you questions like, what is focusing? And so like like we know what focusing is. It's where the beam gets like at its smallest dimension, right? It converges, but they're going to want you to get like real specific with it. Like what is focusing? And so what I have told my students, and this has helped me and I have seen a lot of students do it as well, is I am the transducer and a sound wave is coming out of me, right? The sound wave is coming out of me. Look at that. Okay. Reach your hands out in front of you and grab the focus, right? So see how my hands are far away, right? Because I'm the transducer and the sound wave is coming out of me. I'm reaching my hands out in front of me and I'm grabbing the focus. And when I grab remember the focus is small, right? It's already small, the focus. But when I grab it, I'm making it even smaller. Okay, so like grab it and make it even smaller. You're tightening it, okay? And then you keep your hands locked around the focus and you bring it closer to you. And remember, you are the transducer, right? We're getting really creative today. And so what you're doing when you're focusing, you're making the focal point even tighter. You're bringing it closer. You're moving it closer to the face of the transducer. And your focus as you're bringing it close, remember you're tightening everything. So you're tightening like the whole near zone. And so this gives you like a physical depiction of what focusing does, right? If the focal point gets tighter, the whole near zone gets tighter, and the focus moves closer to the face of the transducer. And so that's all good, right? Like the focus is getting tighter, the near zone length is getting tighter, tight, everything's great. But there is a consequence of focusing. So as you're doing this and this, you have to keep in mind that the disadvantage, right? Because ultrasound's like positive, negative. You're never gonna have like a perfect day. There's always like something, a con to every pro. What happens in the far field is the beam diverges even more. Okay, so like a sound wave would look something like this. Right, so here's my transducer and like here's my original sound wave, right? And I'm gonna focus that transducer. So write the word focus. What ends up happening? All of this tightens up. So it just gets like tighter, tighter, tighter. Okay, so the focal point gets tighter. Let's read what he says. He says, focusing narrows the beam. Beam width is decreased in the focal region. So here in the focal region, which is also called the focal zone or the near zone, right? And he says that in the near zone. And then not only does this happen, you got to remember this, the second and third part to this, that the focus actually is moved closer to the face of the transducer. So it's like moving, remember, you're like grabbing onto that sucker and you're like pulling it in. So it's getting closer to the face of the transducer. And then disadvantage, right? Because we need to have that, is like everything here like spreads out even more. So like you have like two good things, right? My white arrows and my blue arrows represent pros for the con, which is like the green arrow, the diverging of the sound wave. So you guys have to know those like qualities about like focusing in general. What is focusing in general? All right, so pause that, right? We're like, okay, you just have to know what focusing is. And like that's what it is, right? This, and then in the far field, this, okay? Now, how is focusing achieved? We know that we need to focus our sound waves. We know that Bob is going to have to figure out how to focus them. And so he has three options. There's going to be a lot of threes here. So we're talking about focusing. So number one, Bob can use a curved lens. The curved lens is placed on the outside of the PZT, right? And it is considered a fixed form of focusing. What fixed means is that it is not sonographer adjustable. So we don't really have transducers like this. If you think about in the lab, when you're scanning in the lab, all of us can change our focus, right? Like we can move our focus closer to the top. We can move our focus to the bottom. That's because we have adjustable focus. Fixed means like it's locked in place. You cannot change it. That's how transducers used to be. Like when you know, techs that have been around, they used to get these transducers because this is like what was on the market, you know, like it, and you'd buy these transducers and they had like one focus and that was it. Like you were just going to scan with that focus wherever it was because it was fixed in place. So a curved lens goes outside of the PZT. I don't have glasses, but I can't find them. I think they're in my car. But if you think about, here, I got some stuff here. If you think that this might not even work, but if you think about glasses, right? Glasses, they have a curved lens, right? None of them are flat. I mean, sunglasses, yeah, but vision glasses are not flat, right? They have a curve. And what do you do with them? You put them on the front of your eyes to focus your eyes, right? So it's like the same thing with with a curved lens. It's curved, it's not flat, right? Because that's how glasses are for vision, and it's out front of the PZT. The second way that Bob, right? So Bob can put a curved lens in front of the PZT to focus. The second thing that Bob can do is he can curve the actual PZT. So careful here. I'm not saying the PZT shape is going to change. Remember, what is the shape of a PZT in a single element transducer? It's coin or disc shape, right? What is the shape of a PZT in a array transducer? It's a rectangle, right? So it's still going to be a rectangle. The only thing he's going to do is he's going to take it like this and he's just going to bend it, right? That's what a curved PZT is. So it's like he didn't do anything to the shape of it. It's like still a rectangle. He's just going to bend it a little bit. And so that curved PZT is considered an internal type of focusing because it's like the PZT itself. But like, you know, it's still a fixed focus. Like you get what you get. The focus can't be adjusted. We actually don't use any of these transducers in our lab. All of our transducer are adjustable focus, right? So all you guys have been changing your focuses. And the way this is done is with a curved phase delay pattern. And I'm going to talk to you guys about that. This is a form of electronic focusing accomplished by using time delays. Phasing can only be performed on array transducers. So we're going to add some more notes. This curved lens is to a single element transducer. So that one single element transducer, they put the lens, right? They put the lens in front of it. This PZT, when they curve it, it's just one. So I know I kept saying rectangle because I just wanted you guys to remember that like he's not changing the shape. But I apologize. We probably should have thought about like a circle, right? So think about a plate, a paper plate, and you're like bending it, right? Because the single element transducer is rounded or disc or coin, right? So this is also done. It doesn't have to be done, but it's typically done on a single element transducer. And those are both going to be round, right? Arrays is where we know they are rectangular. And so this one here is done on array transducers. So is there more than one PZT? Yes, there is more than one PZT. This is AKAs, right? So make sure you know all of this. We call them phase delay patterns, phasing, or electronic, just electronic. Okay, phase delay patterns, electronic. Say it all the time, say it always together. One more, automatic is another way. So what we say is automatic electronic phasing, because like I don't have to say phase delay patterns. Like, doesn't phasing and phase like sound the same? So I say automatic electronic phasing, automatic electronic phasing. And that way it's like, you know, locked up in here. Okay. And then something I also want you to point out is like, notice, right? So I'm talking about focusing. How is focusing achieved? 3 ways: curved, something's curved here, something's curved here, and something's curved here. The rule with this is with increased curvature, that means more curve, the focus moves closer to the face of the transducer. So if you have a curved lens, it doesn't matter, guys. If you have a curved lens, right? Curved lens, remember they're curved, external to the PZT, out front of the PZT, and fixed focus, single element transducer. If you have a curved lens, or you have the curved PZT, right, where we're like bending it, right? Okay, if you have the curved, it doesn't matter what's curved. If it's curved, the more curved it is, the more it moves the focus closer to the face of the transducer. So, like if you have a PZT, and you put a curved lens in front of it, so like here's my curved lens, right? Or if the PZT itself is curved, right? Like it doesn't really matter what kind, like it's just either the PZT is curved or the lens is curved. The rule with curving is this: the more curved something is, the closer to the face of the transducer. So like if you have a lens that looks like this, or you have a lens that looks like this, they're both curved. If you have a PZT that looks like this, or a PZT that looks like this, it's still curved, right? But what's the difference is the sound wave that comes out of this one will look like this, and the sound wave that comes out of this one will look like this. You got to ask yourself, where's the focus, right? So like here's the focus, here's the focus. Which one has the focus closer to the face of the transducer, right? You're like, I don't know where the face is. Like obviously the face would have to be here, right? Where the one that has more curvature, increased curvature, that's the one that has the sound wave or the focus move closer to it. What I kind of picture is I picture like something that's really curved. I picture like grabbing this. So here's like my hand, 3, 4, 5. How many fingers? I grab it and I like pull it. And when I do that, I'm pulling the focus close to it too. That's what works for me in my brain. Like if it does, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Like take it or leave it. It doesn't matter. But that's how I can remember. I just remember it like yanking it up, more curved PZT, or like more curved lens, and then the focus moves up closer to the face of the transducer. Phasing is the one that's gonna give us a little bit of a hard time. So really, this is what we want to know, right? Like that there's 3 forms of focusing: curved lens, curved PZT, curved phase delay pattern. It's always curved when we're talking about focusing. The first 2 are fixed focuses. That means they're not sonographer adjustable, and they're typically done on single element transducers. The last one, curved phase delay pattern, electronic, automatic, those have to be, it has to be an array transducer. It can't be a single element transducer. And you'll see why in a second. Okay. So, here we go. these blue guys, they're all array PZTs. They're PZTs that are inside of array transducers, right? Notice like here, this is like these are these squiggly black lines, the one that I just drew on, it's supposed to represent like the electricity going to the PZTs, right? So like each PZT, like 1, 2, right? Each PZT has a wire connected to it, and electricity runs down this wire to the PZT, rings it, deforms it, and then it sends out a pulse, right? Remember piezoelectricity, piezoelectric principle. So when electricity goes to all the PZTs, so this represents electricity. I've always done it like this, but you like some students do like little lightning bolts, like whatever, right? But if these lightning bolts or not lightning bolts, I'm tired. The electrical voltages, when the electrical voltages reach these PZTs at the exact same time, so notice they're all on the exact same level. If they travel down the wires to the PZTs to ring the PZTs, they're going to ring them at the same time. The result is going to be a sound wave that looks like this, right? And that's not focused, right? Because it's not focused, right? It's not focused. So our sound waves have to be focused like this, right? This is where it has to be. So the electricity is going to reach the PZTs in this pattern, which means, so look closely at this, which PZTs are going to be receiving the electricity first? The PZTs that are here on the sides are going to be receiving the electricity first. Why? Because the electricity is closer to the PZT. How is that accomplished? Like how is the electricity going to the PZT at different times? Well, it's using time delays, right? So it's like electricity goes to the outside PZTs, and then like a second later, electricity goes to the other PZTs. Like we're going from outside to in, right? PZTs on the outside to the inside. And then like a second later, like another voltage of electricity is sent out. So it's like in between these voltages, so like in between this electricity and this electricity, there was a time delay. In between that one and this one, there's a time delay. So like that's where the word time delay is coming from. So electricity is given to the PZTs using time delays, which creates this curved pattern. So this curved pattern of electricity. So remember what I said to you guys, the more curved the pattern is, right? Grab that, yank it up, the focus is going to move closer to the face of the transducer. The less curved the pattern is, the focus will be deeper and further away from the face of the transducer. So this picture here kind of shows you, and again, like, you know, everybody has their own way of drawing it. And so like whatever you feel, so like if you trace this pattern, this is more curved, this is less curved, and you can see like where the focus is, right? I know it doesn't look like, they could have made it a little bit like more dramatic where the focus is different, but they didn't, and that's okay, because we understand that. And then they're also showing it to you here, like this is more curved and this is less curved, if that helps you. So however you want to draw it. And again, this is what focusing does. This is, you know, what I explained here, grabbing the focus, pulling it towards the face of the transducer, narrowing the focus and that whole near zone length area. Something else I want you to draw. So I want you guys to draw this out. So we're going to draw some PZTs. Okay, just so we can get like an idea. Remember, every PZT will have its electrical wire going to it, and you can spend more time making it like a lot nicer than I have. And I want you to give electricity to these PZTs. And so we're going to do, you know, like I'm going to do this one, and then I'm going to do this one. Are these both curved? Yes. What is the difference between the more curvature and the less curvature in regards to time delays? Well, if you look from here to here, or from here to here, I know it's like hard to tell, but like the more curved the pattern is, the phasing pattern, the automatic pattern, the electronic pattern, whatever, the more curved it is, it represents a bigger time delay between elements. So this orange line right here represents larger time delays between elements. And then obviously the other side is like smaller time delays between elements, but that's going to be on the SPI. So you guys need to know, how do we focus, right? How is Bob going to focus my transducer? Because I'm only going to buy a focus transducer from Bob. He has the option of using a curved lens, a curved PZT, or a curved phase delay pattern, which is also called automatic electronic focusing. And for all three, I need you to keep in mind that the more curved it is, that'll move the focus closer to the face of the transducer. With phasing, with this right here, because we're talking about time. So do you guys see why it has to be more than one PZT? Because like, remember, one PZT has one wire coming from it. So like, obviously to give like time delays in the electricity, you need like multiple wires, which means like multiple PZTs, right? And so with the greater curvature phase delay pattern, the more curvature comes a greater time delay difference between, or like greater time delays between the elements, like the time that they receive their electricity. And then with the less curvature, it is smaller time delays between elements. And the time delays are really small. He's going to tell us. He says, like, I'm not sure where he says it. He says it, I think, like in some random spot, but it's lower. It's less than 1 microsecond. Like that. When I'm saying time delays, it's like they're really small time delays. So the time delays, I mean, it's like quick, right? Like ultrasound happens so fast. So like it's lower. I think it's microseconds. The time delays are less than 1 microsecond. So like between electricity reaching the PZTs. So it's like super fast. I also need you to know how to describe focusing, which was this here, right? Like this is this and pulling it. And so this is how to describe focusing. So our transducers have to be focused. But there's also something else called steering, which we're going to talk about on the next lecture. So go ahead and watch this. This will be up for a couple of days. Review it. Feel free to ask questions, and then I will try to get to your questions as soon as possible. And, just like anything, the more you review it, the more it makes sense. Talk out loud. Right? Write on your whiteboard, draw pictures on your whiteboard as you're drawing, as you're writing, you're saying it. You're hearing your words, like you're hearing your tone of voice, you're hearing, and try to be like, I'm like I try to be like kind of animated, like, silly things. Like you guys might remember the pink glasses, like really silly things. Like I try to, like do this and do this. And that's just like silly little things that your brain remembers, like instead of someone just, you're just like monotone. You're like, there are 3 ways of focusing. Like the fact that we gave the guy that works at the manufacturing company the name of Bob, like it's just silly things, but that's like what you got to do, right? Like physics is pretty boring. So like figuring out how to like make it more interactive, or that not only will help you get through it, right? But it also helps that stuff like stick in your brain a little bit better. So Yeah. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you guys later. Have a good one.